regard to the proposed exhibits on behalf of the applicant, is there any objection to their admission?
No, Your Honor, that is a correct recitation of our agreement. However, with regard to some of those exhibits, as we discussed in chambers, it's with the caveat that they are being admitted to streamline the process, but that any portions that were ruled upon by the court that would not come in, such as discussion related to Alfredo Parish, for example, that would not be considered by the court.
All right. The identified exhibits on behalf of the applicant will be admitted to the extent any portion of the admitted exhibits would contain information that was previously ruled on as not admissible by the court. The court will not consider that portion of the admitted exhibit. And then with regard to the state's identified exhibits, those will be admitted as well. Any other preliminary matters that we need to address before getting back into evidence on behalf of the applicant?
No, Your Honor.
Anything on behalf of the state?
No, Your Honor. Thank you.
All right. You may call your first witness then.
Thank you, Your Honor. We call Dr. Jennifer Hammers.
Good morning, doctor. Take your time. Come forward and have a seat in the chair to my left. Yep, go ahead and have a seat. If you'd raise your right hand. You've been called as a witness. Do you swear the testimony you're about to give will be true and correct?
I do.
Okay, and then there's a microphone in front of you, a bottom button in the center. Perfect. And then you can adjust the chair and the microphone so that you can sit comfortably.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. Thompson, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good morning, Dr. Hammers.
Good morning.
Can you please introduce yourself to the court?
Sure. My name is Jennifer Hammers, Jennifer Hammers.
Were you retained as an expert by attorneys for Todd Mullis in this case?
Yes, I was.
And are you here this morning to offer opinions about your evaluation and work in this case?
Yes, I am.
We'll get to that in a minute, but I want to start by asking you about your background and experience. What is your current profession, Dr. Hammers?
I am a forensic pathologist.
Briefly, what is forensic pathology?
Forensic pathology is a subspecialty of pathology, which is a specialized area of medicine that specifically focuses on the investigation and determination of cause and manner of death, primarily for decedents who die suddenly or unexpectedly.
Where is your practice based out of?
It's based out of Western Pennsylvania, so in the Pittsburgh area.
Do you currently work as a forensic pathologist for any governmental entities?
My business holds contracts with different counties, which are governmental entities, to perform autopsies for their counties.
Why do those counties have contracts with you to perform those autopsies?
So they're small counties that aren't large enough to have their own medical examiner system, like there are in many larger cities and states. And so those small counties will contract with forensic pathologists to perform their autopsies, because the coroners who are responsible for the investigation are not typically physicians or even are not typically forensic pathologists or even physicians.
Do you perform the same services for those counties that a medical examiner would in a larger county?
Yes, I do.
In your capacity with your contracts with those counties, do you work with police and law enforcement at all?
I do.
And what do you do in that capacity with law enforcement?
I get information from law enforcement about their investigation. I'll get reconstruction reports if the police do accident reconstruction, and depending on the county, there will be detectives or police who will show up to observe the autopsy, take photos from the autopsy, or collect evidence.
I want to come back to your current employment in a minute, but let's talk briefly about your education. Are you a medical school graduate?
I am.
What degree do you have?
I have a DO, or a Doctor of Osteopathic Medicine.
Is that different from an MD?
The medical training is the same. There's some additional training in osteopathic manipulation that osteopathic physicians get, but essentially the basics of the medical education and the time that it takes to become a physician and the training is the same.
After graduation, did you do a residency?
Yes, I did.
For how long?
For 4 years.
And after your residency, did you do a fellowship?
Yes.
Where?
I did my forensic fellowship at the New York City Medical Examiner's Office based in Manhattan, and I stayed there for a second year of fellowship, specifically focused on forensic neuropathology and cardiac pathology.
What did you do during your fellowship?
So I performed autopsies primarily. I testified in court to my findings, and in my second year, I served on the consultant service to examine hearts and brains that were saved from our forensic cases. During that year, I also continued to perform autopsies.
While you were performing your fellowship in New York, were the autopsies that you were performing only on people who had been residents of New York City before they died?
No, the jurisdiction, the law indicates that anybody who dies within the city, it's the responsibility of the medical examiner to investigate and determine the cause and manner of death. So that included tourists, people who were brought into hospitals in New York City from other states or other counties. Those all fell under our jurisdiction.
In addition to things that for you would be typical autopsies, did you perform any autopsies involving atypical deaths?
Yes, certainly.
Can you give me some examples?
Sure. We had deaths that were unusual because of being in a city. We had people who jumped off of buildings and bridges and would be injured by objects on the ground or close to the ground. We had, because of the nature of the medical centers there, we had people from rural areas that either had work-related accidents, industrial accidents, that would be brought into the city.
When your fellowship was over in New York City, where did you go?
I took a job as a medical examiner in Boston, Massachusetts, working for the Commonwealth.
And what geographic area did your work in that office cover?
So we covered all the cases from the Boston area, but we also received cases from the entire Commonwealth, so all the way to the western border.
And just like in New York City, what kinds of cases did you see while you were there that might be different from more typical cases?
So certainly a lot of water-related deaths. We had an increase in rural deaths, so vehicular accidents, farming accidents, accidents, in the woods while skiing on a mountain, those types of things.
After your time in Boston, where did you go next?
I moved back to New York City. I was invited to come back and work there, so I went back to the New York City Medical Examiner's Office and worked for 4 years.
Did you have any particular responsibilities during those 4 years in New York?
So in addition to doing autopsies again, for the first 2 years, I was the fellowship program director for the 2 programs that I had graduated from. And so that meant that I was responsible for training and helping maintain the accreditation for that program. So I did a lot of teaching of the fellows during those 2 years that I was in Manhattan. The second 2 years I moved to Brooklyn and I was the deputy chief medical examiner of the Kings County facility, which covered cases for Staten Island and Brooklyn. And in that role, I basically was in charge of running that office, the day-to-day operations. There were 7 other medical examiners that worked with me. The fellows rotated. We had medical students from primarily from Downstate University. And then a staff of about 40 people. So I ran that office and then was part of the City Medical Examiner's executive team, which made decisions about hiring, budgets, running the DNA lab, running all of the offices and the training programs.
For those jobs that you had in Boston and New York, did you testify in court?
Yes, I did.
And did you testify in cases where your conclusion was that the death involved was a homicide?
Yes.
Did you testify in cases where you drew other conclusions?
Yes.
What did you do after your time in New York?
So I was looking for a job or evaluating jobs as a chief medical examiner, and ultimately was offered a position in a private practice in Pittsburgh with Dr. Cyril Wecht. So I accepted that position and moved to Pittsburgh to work with him in his private practice to help him perform autopsies.
Is Dr. Wecht still alive?
No, unfortunately, he passed away just about a year ago.
And what was your job with Dr. Wecht?
So my job was to work for his practice. I primarily performed autopsies, completed autopsy reports, and testified in court to those findings.
Did you ultimately leave Dr. Wecht's practice?
I did.
When did you do that?
In November of 2022.
And what did you do next?
So in November of 2022, I started working for myself full-time. And so I had already been performing per diem autopsies for other counties that needed help or when people were on vacation. And I had my own medical legal consulting cases that I worked on. So I just transitioned into doing that full-time.
And why did you do that?
I felt like after, almost 10 years working for the government and 5 years of working for Dr. Wecht at 15 years of experience, I had always wanted to either run an office or work for myself, and I felt like that was a good time for me to do that.
How many employees does your business have now?
We have, between full-time and part-time people who work with us, 14 people.
You told us earlier that you hold contracts to perform autopsies for various counties in Pennsylvania. Is that right?
Yes.
What percentage of your time in your current practice is spent doing work for those counties?
I would say probably about 60 to 70%.
And in terms of the demographics of those counties, are they rural or urban or suburban, or what is their makeup?
They're primarily rural, with one county having some small areas that are, I would consider, a little more suburban.
And for the autopsies that you've performed for those rural counties, what kinds of injuries are you seeing at autopsy?
The whole variety. We see the typical cases that medical examiners see, like, motor vehicle crashes and gunshot wounds, but we see a lot of deaths in more rural areas, like people on dirt bikes or ATVs, farms, people at work who are passing away, those types of cases.
In your current practice, do you testify in court?
I do.
And have you testified on cases in your current practice where your opinion has been that the manner of death was a homicide?
Yes.
All right, you said that I think you said 60 to 70% of your current practice is with those counties, is that right?
Yes.
What else are you doing with the rest of your professional time currently?
So I participate in medical legal consultations, like I've done on this case, and a large amount of that other time is spent teaching and as the pathology division chief at the Duquesne University College of Osteopathic Medicine.
I want to come back to your teaching in a minute, but you mentioned that you do consulting work. Can you explain what a consulting forensic pathologist does?
Sure. So primarily we're asked to review records. Typically it's cases where either a living or decedent person has had evaluations, and I'm given either medical records, autopsy reports, photographs, investigative information, and I'm asked to review that, analyze that, and offer independent opinions based off of my review.
Who are the clients that retain you for those consultations?
Attorneys do.
In what kinds of cases?
All kinds of cases. I've consulted in civil cases. I've consulted in criminal cases, both for the prosecution and the defense, Title IX cases, on college campuses, arbitrations, living victims of things like strangulation, so a whole variety.
And are you retained more often for one side or the other in those consults?
I would say for the consultations, it's probably about 50-50.
And have you been called to consult on criminals cases as well as civil cases?
Yes, I have.
In some of those consults, are you performing an autopsy?
I'm sorry, what did you ask me?
Sure. For some of the cases that you're consulting on, have you been asked to perform an autopsy?
Oh, occasionally. It's uncommon, but yes.
And for those cases where you're not performing an autopsy, but you're consulting, do you follow a different procedure in terms of the way that you evaluate the case?
No, I follow the same procedure.
Well, if you're not performing an autopsy, how are you able to get information to aid in your evaluation?
Well, I'm using the autopsy and the information that's documented in the report, in the photos, in their investigative reports, and reviewing that and drawing my own conclusions from that, and then placing that autopsy into the context of all of the other information that's available, just like I would do if I performed the autopsy.
As a consulting pathologist, do you have clients who retain you to provide opinions in a case who elect ultimately not to use those opinions?
Yes. So my opinions are my opinions. If they choose to use them, they may. If not, then they may not.
Is it a concern for you if a client elects not to use your opinions?
No, it's not.
All right. You mentioned that you teach, and in addition to your work with Duquesne University, are you teaching anywhere else currently?
I teach at Duquesne University in 2 other programs other than the medical school, in the Masters of Forensic Science and Law program and at the law school at Duquesne. And then I teach a course at Boston University in their Masters of Anthropology program.
Have you presented and published on topics in forensic pathology?
Yes.
Are you a licensed physician?
I am.
In what states?
Pennsylvania, New York, Massachusetts, and California.
Are you board certified in any subjects?
Yes.
What subjects?
Anatomic and clinical pathology and forensic pathology.
Are you a member of any forensic pathology professional societies?
I am.
What societies?
I'm a member of our 2 national societies, the National Association of Medical Examiners and the American Academy of Forensic Sciences.
Do you hold any leadership or committee positions in forensic pathology?
I do.
And can you tell me about any of those?
Sure. So I am part of the American Board of Pathology's test development review committee for our continuing certification, which are questions that we have to answer quarterly in order to maintain our license. So on that committee, we review questions, we edit them, we update them, make sure they're current, look at feedback from the test takers, and consider that. I also am part of the ACGME, which is the Graduate Medical Education Council, which certifies our training programs in pathology. So both in primary pathology, anatomic and clinical, and all of the subspecialties. So we review those programs annually and issue citations if programs are non-compliant with the requirements.
In total, Dr. Hammers, at this point in your career, how many autopsies have you performed?
Probably just under about 6,000.
Have you been qualified as an expert in forensic pathology in the past?
Yes, I have.
Has a court ever determined that you were not qualified as a forensic pathologist?
No, it is not.
In your career with teaching, have you been involved in running any teachings or trainings for law enforcement?
I have.
And can you tell me what that has been?
Sure. So for the last probably 5 or so years, I've taught for the Pennsylvania State Police, who put on a basic homicide, advanced homicide, and cold case lecture series or educational series. There's probably about a total of 5 of those trainings a year between the 3 of them, and I lecture in all 3 of them.
At this point, Your Honor, we're seeking to qualify Dr. Hammers as an expert in the field of forensic pathology.
Does the state desire any additional record?
No, Your Honor. I don't think this is necessary under Iowa law. She's qualified by her testimony or opinions, there's no requirement that the court make that finding.
I agree. Certainly, I agree that this witness qualifies as an expert.
I'll proceed, Your Honor. Thank you. Are the opinions that you're going to offer in your testimony today, Dr. Hammers, opinions that you hold to a reasonable degree of medical certainty?
Yes, they are.
And the opinions that you're going to testify about today are those opinions you reached using techniques that are generally accepted in the field of forensic pathology?
Yes.
I'm going to show you what's been marked as Exhibit 276. And just so the court's aware while that's being pulled up, Your Honor, I don't think for this exhibit, but for other exhibits that have been admitted today, we do intend to publish those to the gallery today.
Just let me know, I guess, counsel, if there's one that you would like
Thank you,
put
Your
up
Honor.
on the big screen.
Thank you. Do you see Exhibit 276 in front of you, Dr. Hammers?
I do.
And if you need to look through it to answer this question, please let us know. But is this a true and accurate copy of your CV and the report that you issued about your opinions in this case?
I only see the cover sheet of my CV.
If you'll look, we'll
Sure.
move through that for you.
Can you go just a little bit slower because it's all gray? That's okay. Thank you. Go ahead.
Have you had a chance to look at Exhibit 276?
Yes, sorry, it came back to the CV again. So
All right.
yes, I see.
Is that a true and accurate copy of your report in this case and your CV?
It does appear to be, yes.
All right, and Your Honor, at this point, we're seeking to admit into evidence Exhibit 276.
Judge, if I may, sorry.
Yep, any objection?
276 in the CV, we have no objection to that portion of it. The report that Dr. Hammers authored, which I think is dated March 10th of 2023, correct?
I believe so.
Is hearsay, since it was prepared in preparation for litigation, is not admissible. I believe there's also some affidavits that are attached to it that are likewise hearsay as well. So that's our objection.
The court will take those objections under advisement, and we'll move forward since this is a bench trial. You may continue.
And I have a binder for the witness of Exhibit 276 and two other reports that I think we've conferred about and may seek to offer into evidence, but not at this time. I just want the witness to have them available for her testimony. So we'll provide that notebook to her.
Okay, Mr. Brown, did you want to review whatever this is that the witness is going to have available to
So
her?
I was provided a copy of that before
Okay.
we came in, and I know we've already discussed this issue back in chambers. We are going to have an objection to the two other reports that are contained in that binder for the reasons we stated in chambers. And just for the record, this is in the two cases that we gave the court, or three, was in Rake, Stenzel, 827 Northwest 2nd, 690, 2013 Iowa Supreme Court case, which also references two other cases, State versus Barrett, 445 Northwest 2nd, 749, an Iowa Supreme Court case from 1989, and Bruner versus Brown, 480 Northwest 2nd 33, Iowa Supreme Court case from 1992. Our objection would be to those reports and the consideration of those by the witness, inasmuch as they're going to use them in this way, just to alert the court to this. The expert here is, as State versus Barrett says, does not subscribe to the same conclusion. Essentially, what we believe this is going to be is vouching. It also is the same 5.703, which is the rule of evidence. I believe that they're going to be relying on is not intended to be a mechanism for experts to self-bolster their own opinions with the opinions of other experts. That's Bruner versus Brown, the case I just cited. So I realize the court may take all of this information subject to that objection, but inasmuch as she relies on that, where it crosses this line that clearly Iowa's case law indicates that she cannot cross, we would ask the court to certainly consider our objection under those circumstances.
Ms. Thompson, did you wish to make any additional record on this point at this time?
I was going to say I'd like to reserve argument on this issue, Your Honor.
Okay, and that's fine. Obviously, I don't know how the testimony is going to come in yet. I understand that this may be an issue as it does, and certainly I'll allow both parties an opportunity to make any additional arguments that they wish. You may proceed at this point, Ms. Thompson.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Hammers, you mentioned earlier that you were retained by Mr. Mullis's counsel to review materials related to this case and offer your opinions. What specifically were you asked to do?
I was asked to review multiple pieces of information, review them, analyze them, and offer opinions concerning my review based off of my education, training, and experience.
All right, now, you did not conduct an autopsy of Ms. Mullis in this case, is that right?
That's correct, I did not.
All right, did the fact that you are not a person who conducted an autopsy in this case limit your ability to reach opinions about her death or about the pattern of her injuries?
It does not.
Why not?
I'm able to review Dr. Cruz's autopsy report, the photographs that she had taken, the toxicology report, the medical records, EMS records, and the photographs that Dr. Thompson had taken at the hospital, and analyze all of those just like I would if I was doing the autopsy and preparing to sign a death certificate, and be able to issue opinions based off of that.
Did your process in evaluating Ms. Mullis's death differ from the process you'd follow in cases where you did perform the autopsy?
My process did not, no.
In general terms, what sources of information did you rely on to evaluate Ms. Mullis's death?
So I had the autopsy report, photographs, toxicology report. I had medical records from Ms. Mullis's hospital visit on the 6th of November, as well as when she came to the hospital the day that she passed away. I had the investigative reports from the police documenting the events the day that she passed away. I had Dr. Thompson's information from the hospital, as well as his photographs. I additionally received a report that Dr. Wecht had issued and a report that Dr. Boley had issued regarding their review of the case as well.
Now, you mentioned that Ms. Mullis had gone to the hospital on November 6th. How close in time was that to her going to the hospital related to her injuries in this case?
So it was about 4 days.
What was your understanding of why she went to the hospital that day?
She had a medical procedure that was like a same-day procedure that she underwent on that day.
What was that procedure?
It was what's called a DNC, or dilatation and curettage. It's a procedure on the uterus that can assist if someone is having continued uterine bleeding.
Was Ms. Mullis having that problem?
Yes, that's why she presented.
Why did you want to review records related to that procedure in this case?
Well, especially with it being so close in time to her passing away, I noticed that there had been some reports that the day that she passed away, that she had some complaints of feeling tired, maybe being kind of dizzy, and she had just kind of started back to working on the farm that day after the procedure because she hadn't been feeling well. And so it's best practice to have a person's medical information in general, but certainly if they have a procedure or some kind of change in their medical history around the time that they die, it's good to know what procedure they had, any medications they were on, and anything that was documented at the hospital during that time.
As part of your, the records that you reviewed in this case, did you review any records from the emergency medical services staff who'd provided assistance to Ms. Mullis on her way to the hospital?
Yes, I did.
Did you review the Greeley Fire Department pre-hospital care report?
Yes.
Why did you look at the EMS records?
So my standard practice and everywhere that I've worked is that when I know that there are pre-hospital records from EMS or fire first responders, is to get information from those records, either to have an investigator gather that information and have it in our report prior to autopsy, or to gather just the records themselves and be able to review them to understand what medical procedures were done and what their observations were, because findings and observations can change over the course of time prior to autopsy. So it's nice to have those different steps to be able to analyze each person's view of what they saw and what they did along the way.
And you said that you also reviewed medical records from Ms. Mullis being brought to the hospital where she passed away?
Yes, I did.
And why did you review those records?
So to understand, was her condition the same when EMS saw her as when she came to the hospital? Did anything change? Did they do any kind of additional testing that would help understand why she's passing away? Did they make any observations that either weren't present at autopsy or were different than autopsy and different than what Dr. Thompson, his photographs and his report showed?
Reviewing these categories of records, prior medical care, EMS records, medical care from the day that she passed, is review of those kinds of records part of the general practices of forensic pathologists reaching cause and manner of death determinations?
Yes. So in my training, in every place I've worked, and in all of my understanding of forensic pathology practice, that is part of the process and is the beginning part of the process even prior to autopsy.
And is it the general practice of forensic pathologists to review those records before reaching opinions about cause and manner of death?
Yes.
Did you review any records or photographs from the Delaware County Sheriff's Office in this case?
Yes, I did.
What did you review?
There were some, I think, two specific accounts of deputies. I think they're deputies. I'm sorry if I'm misstating that, but who had been the responders at the scene and had gone back to the farm and looked in the shed and taken some photographs.
Did you rely only on those materials to gain an understanding of the shed or issues related to the Mullis farm?
No, not just those.
What else did you do?
So I went and visited the farm and the shed to see the space for myself.
Is that a common practice for forensic pathologists?
I would say that it's not common for a forensic pathologist to go to every scene, but certainly we can choose to go to any scene that we would like to. And in cases where there's a question of in my experience, it tends to be a question of determining the manner of death that I've gone to scenes, but it could be the cause of death as well. And if you just don't have sort of what you need from the photos or the investigative report, or you need to kind of see, could this happen in the way that it's being posed to me or the way that I think it may have happened from the autopsy, it can be helpful to go to the scene.
Is gaining an understanding of the scene, whether through records review or a forensic pathologist's own investigation, is that a generally accepted practice in the field of forensic pathology?
It is. Typically, the only time that there isn't a scene investigation is if somebody dies at the hospital, but that would tend to be like if they're dying under natural causes. If there are unnatural causes, then certainly going back to the scene, depending on the circumstances, would be something that would be quite common for the investigators at the office, at least, to go and do.
Now, you referenced as part of your evaluation in this case, reaching determinations about the cause and manner of Ms. Mullis's death.
Yes.
Is that a determination you've made in this case?
Yes.
Before we get to what your determinations are, what process did you follow to reach your opinions in this case?
So I would say that in this case and every case, I follow sort of a standard like scientific method to the process that I undergo in order to evaluate a death.
What is that process generally?
So basically it is gathering the beginning information that we've talked about, like the circumstances of death, the first responders, some medical information prior to the autopsy, at the autopsy performing the external exam or looking at the outside of the body, and collecting any evidence or pictures, things like that that we need. And from there, formulating some ideas or hypothesis about what the cause and manner of death likely is, and then taking those into the autopsy, performing the autopsy, collecting additional samples like for toxicology or to look under the microscope at different tissues, and kind of testing those hypotheses of what we believe may be the likely cause and manner of death, and then waiting for the additional testing to come back, like the toxicology report, and then reevaluating those hypotheses of the cause and manner of death, and then ultimately, if we need more information at that point, going back and asking for it in order to make sure that we have everything we need to issue the cause and manner of death, and that there isn't anything outstanding that could be an important factor to that. And so when we get to that point, that's when we're going to issue the cause and manner of death and issue the death certificate.
All right, and Dr. Hammers, you described at the point where you've conducted the external exam in an autopsy, that being the point where you develop your hypotheses. In your practice of developing cause and manner of death determinations, are there cases where after the external examination of the body at autopsy, you make a determination of your opinions about cause and manner of death?
So after my external exam, I often have a pretty, I mean, depending on the case, I can have a pretty good idea of what is happening depending on what injuries I see on the body or what I don't see. But I always need the internal examination to be able to definitively examine those tissues inside and understand. So a good example would be, you know, I might see a gunshot wound that's in the chest. I can tell that it went in and it went out, but I won't know how much bleeding is inside the chest. I won't know what organs necessarily that it struck without doing the internal exam. So knowing basic anatomy, I could come up with some presumptions of what likely happened, but I wouldn't know until I actually did the autopsy. And the autopsy is typically what allows you to better understand the mechanism of somebody's death or the physiologic changes that are happening to them.
All right. So as part of your review of this case, did you have materials in front of you that would let you conduct an external review of Ms. Mullis's injuries?
Yes.
And just before we start to talk about this, do people in your field sometimes use the word defect in talking about injuries?
Yes.
What does defect mean in that context?
Defect tends to be used as like an injury or a hole that you can see in either the skin or an organ, and typically it's used when you're not really sure what it's from. So you may say this is a defect, and then ultimately you come to a more specific conclusion that it's a gunshot wound defect or a stab wound defect, and you may call it then an injury. So defect tends to be a general term when we're not sure or we're not yet sure more specifically what caused it.
All right, in your review of Ms. Mullis's body in this case, did you determine that areas of her body had injuries?
Yes.
Where were her injuries?
So she had puncture types of injuries on her back and extending over to her back right side. And then she had blunt type of injuries on different parts of her body.
And we're going to talk about both of those injuries, or both of those types of injuries, but just in general, thinking about, in your evaluation of both the injuries to her back and the injuries to other areas of her body, did you consider both of those categories of injuries in reaching your opinion?
I did.
Was there one category that was more significant than another?
Yes.
And which was more significant?
So the puncture defects that were on her back and extending to her right side were ultimately the significant injuries that she had.
Your Honor, at this point, I want to show the witness and publish to the gallery Exhibit 573, which has been admitted into evidence. And this is a version of that exhibit which has been cropped somewhat for privacy reasons, which I think the state saw yesterday.
Kelly, do you see the remotes for the big TVs anywhere?
I don't see them.
Oh, it's on. Just needed to wake up, I guess.
Do you have the exhibit in front of you, Dr. Hammers?
I do.
What are we looking at here in Exhibit 573?
So this is a photograph of Miss Mullis's back, particularly looking at it from the right side. In the upper right, you can see the back of her, where her arm meets her shoulder, so like the back of the armpit area. And there are 6 puncture defects that are on her right backside, extending across her back. And amongst some of those, there's one abrasion or scraping type of injury to the skin.
Are you familiar with a term, wound pattern analysis?
Yes.
What is that?
That's essentially when you look at each individual wound and look at any specific features like the size, the shape, the orientation, and the features around the wound. And then when you take all of the wounds that you have and look at them for any kind of patterns that they might have, or similarities or differences that they might have, to try to group some or all of the injuries together to understand how someone may have sustained those injuries.
Did you do that type of analysis on the injuries that, on Ms. Mullis's body?
Yes, I did.
And first of all, in general terms, how would you describe the injuries that we're seeing in Exhibit 573?
So all of the injuries but that small scrape to the skin are all puncture types of defects or penetrating defects, meaning that the injury is going deeper into the body than it is large on the surface of the skin.
Can you give me an example of something that would be a penetrating defect?
Yes, so common things that we see that are penetrating defects would be things like gunshot wounds and stab wounds.
Right. Those aren't the only types of penetrating defects, I take it?
No, there's multiple other types of objects that can cause penetrating defects, but those are the most common that we see.
Right. In this case, you've reviewed Dr. Cruz's reports, and you reviewed prior testimony from Dr. Cruz as well. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
In Dr. Cruz's analysis or Dr. Cruz's testimony about this case, did she assign letters to various of these wounds?
Yes, she did.
All right, and have you adopted those letters in your analysis?
Yes.
Which letters have been assigned to which of these wounds in this case?
So she labeled them letters A through F. 6 wounds lettered A through F, and she started on the right side, which is the right side of this picture, with A, and then moving across the body B and C. And then D she labeled as the lowest wound, and then E and F traveling upward.
To make sure that I understand, wound A is on the right side of the picture under her armpit, is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
And do you see a wound that is up from the ruler, but sort of at the end of the ruler?
Yes,
What, is that B?
that is B, correct.
All right, then in the middle of the photograph, I get, well, more on the left side of the photograph, but in line with B, do you see 3 injuries and a line?
Yes,
Okay, so the injury that has the line, that's what you described as an abrasion, is that right?
that's correct.
The injury that is below that abrasion, which number, or which letter is that?
That was wound D.
All right, and then above wound D, there are 2 injuries right there,
Yes.
and which is on the right?
C is on the right, and E is on the left.
All right, and then there's another injury that's more to the top left-hand corner of the photo?
Yes.
What's that?
That Dr. Cruz labeled as F.
Right. Are any of these wounds, A through F, different from other wounds in the pattern?
They all are penetrating injuries, but some of them are just looking at them without adjusting them or moving the skin or examining them further. Some of them are larger than other ones, and some of them are a little bit smaller.
Which are larger?
Wounds A and B are the largest, with wound A being the larger of the 2. And then wounds E and F are slightly larger than C and D.
And when you're talking about being larger or smaller in this context, are you talking about depth or circumference, or what are you referencing?
So just looking at the skin here, the differences that you can see are going to be in the somewhat the size and shape of the actual defect in the skin, or the hole in the skin, and then the skin around that defect that has some changes where you can see discoloration, which is abrasion and contusion or scraping and bleeding.
Looking at well, in general with these wounds, did any of them have exit wounds on Miss Mullis's body that were associated with them?
So wound A had an injury on the front right breast that was in line with all of the injury path that was ultimately described on the internal examination, and was the end point of that injury path.
You mentioned earlier in your testimony that it's important to that part of your analysis is to look at medical records or records of treatment from different periods of time to gain an understanding of treatment over time. In that context, can the appearance of injuries on someone's body change over time?
Yes, they can.
And can you explain why that's the case?
Sure. So anytime the skin is broken or damaged, it makes the skin go from dry to having moisture, and anytime there's moisture on the skin or on an injury, that area is subject to drying, and that can change the color, the extent, and some of the features of the wounds.
I think we've identified which of these wounds have which letter. And I think it's your testimony that these wounds had different depths, is that right?
I did not testify to that, but they did have different depths, yes.
And sorry, I want to go through and talk about the depths of these wounds, so let's start there. So for wound A, the wound on the right, how deep was that wound?
Off the top of my head, my recollection was that was about 6.5 inches deep.
And what about wound B, the next wound over?
That one was not quite as deep. I believe it was about 6 inches. And I don't know if you want me to look at the autopsy report or not, just to make sure that I'm giving you the accurate measurements.
Let me ask you this. Did you review records from Dr. Cruz where she noted measurements of the depths of these wounds at the autopsy?
Yes, in her notes and at the autopsy, she had these documented, the size, the features surrounding the wounds, the depths of the wounds, and the measurements between the wounds and the orientation of them.
And before we talk a little more about depth, let me ask you this. Just looking at the external appearance of these wounds, the way that you see them in Exhibit 573, for you as a forensic pathologist, can you draw any conclusions about a situation where you have a pattern of wounds where some of them have different appearance than the others?
Yes, I mean, I can come up with possibilities.
And what are some possibilities for why that might be the case?
So it could be that there is movement of an object while it's in the body, which can extend the size and change some of the features around of the surrounding skin. And it can be that there are more shallow or deeper depths of penetration with an object, which can change the appearance slightly. So if you presume that it's the same object causing all of the injuries, you could explain differences in them based off of movement and the depth of the penetration.
All right, and you mentioned that you think that the concept of movement is relevant to considering the pattern of injuries. Is that right?
Yes.
How does it impact your analysis of injuries to think about the body as something that moves?
So it can change two things. So if an object, thinking about an object penetrating the body and being in the body while there's movement, that can change the size and features of the wound itself. But then looking at the body as a whole and knowing that particularly this part of the body, the torso or the chest, back, and abdomen is highly movable, it allows me to know that there can be a movement of the location of the body either closer together or further apart based off of the position that the person's body is in at the time that they're sustaining the injuries.
You mentioned earlier that having access to the measurements of the depths would aid in your testimony. And let me ask you first, in addition to looking at measurements from Dr. Cruz of the depths of these wounds, did you have access to measurements that Dr. Cruz took of the distance between the wounds?
Yes, she had those in her notes, and she had, I think, all but one of them from her notes were in her autopsy report as well.
And was that information you took into account in your analysis?
Yes, it was.
Why?
Because understanding that information aids in understanding and coming to conclusions about how this set of injuries might have been sustained.
Would looking at a demonstrative of the photographs of Ms. Mullis's wounds with some of those distances noted on it, would that aid in your testimony?
Yes.
All right, at this point, Your Honor, I'm going to show the witness a demonstrative, which we provided to the state to aid in the witness's testimony.
And as I understand it, that's been reviewed and there's no objection. Is that correct?
Yeah, correct, Judge. Yeah.
All right, thank you.
Are you able to see the demonstrative in front of you, Dr. Hammers?
Yes, I am.
And what is the demonstrative that you're looking at show?
So this shows the injuries that we just saw in the previous picture, similar orientation and view, but has added colored lines and measurements between the wounds, kind of in a order from A to B, B to C, C to D, etc. And it shows the measurements that Dr. Cruz made and documented of the distances between those wounds that are the actual numbers in inches.
Just one moment, Your Honor. Thank you, Your Honor. I'm going to show the witness a slightly different demonstrative, which I believe the state has also seen. Dr. Hammers, what does the demonstrative in front of you show?
So this is an image that shows wounds B through F, as well as that small abrasion. You're not able to see wound A on this picture because it's a little more toward the right side, but this is a more straight-on picture of Miss Mullis's back, showing 5 of the 6 injuries, showing those lines again between the injuries with the measurements that Dr. Cruz took. But this time it also, next to the large black letter that is the wound that Dr. Cruz designated and that we've kept for this discussion, it shows the size of the wound as she measured it in parenthesis, and then the depth of the wound, meaning how far or long into the body that she measured the path of the injury going.
And so does looking at this diagram help you tell us, help you review for us what the depths of these various wounds were?
Yes.
Can you, I understand we can't see wound A on here, and we'll get to that in a minute, but can you tell us what the relative depths of wounds B through F were on Miss Mullis's back?
Sure. So wound B went 6.5 inches deep. Wound C went 3 3/4 of an inch deep. Wound D went 2 inches deep, and wound E was 6 1/2 inches deep, and wound F was 3 3/4 of an inch deep.
So B and E are the deepest wounds?
Of these 5, yes, those are the 2 deepest wounds.
Right, and which is the shallowest wound?
Wound D at 2 inches was the most shallow.
As an aside, I mean, looking at the measurements here between the wounds, for instance, did Dr. Cruz mention that the distance between wound B and wound C was 3 inches?
Yes, she did.
Does that mean that if wounds B and C were sustained at the same time, that they were 3 inches apart at the time an injury was sustained?
They may have been, but not necessarily based off of the position of Miss Mullis's body.
And can you explain why the position would impact that?
Sure. So with the torso and specifically the back, a person is able to either hyperflex or hyperextend. So in hyperflexion, they would be kind of like pulled forward with their shoulders forward, maybe bent forward, and hyperextended, they would be back, like with their shoulders back, their back arched, maybe their neck back, or even twisted, bent to the side or rotated to the side. And so those positions are going to change the distance, the actual distance at the time of the injury between those 2 injuries. So it could be that the injuries were sustained with the body at 3 inches apart, or it could have been closer or further away.
Does the fact that someone's back, as you've described, can move and twist, does that mean that it's not possible to draw conclusions about the pattern of the wound, given that those distances might change?
No, you can still make some hypothesis or draw similarities from the wounds, both from all of the measurements that we've talked about so far.
All right, I'm going to show you an additional diagram. I'm going to show you an additional diagram that adds in wound A to these measurements. Would that aid in your testimony?
Yes.
All right. Is what you're looking at in this demonstrative the picture we've been looking at with measurements of wounds B through F, with some measurements between wound A and B added?
Yes.
And where wound A on the left side would be under Miss Mullis's armpit in an area that's between her side and her armpit, correct?
Correct.
And that's what's depicted on the other photo?
Yes.
Okay. Can you tell us what the depth of wound A was?
So the depth of wound A was 6 inches.
All right. And what was the relative distance between wound A and wound B?
It was 4.5 inches.
And I want to make sure that what I said was clear. I think I may have said that wound A was on the left side. Would wound A have been to the right of wound B on this picture we're looking at on the left side of the left of the two photographs?
Yes, in the left of the two photographs, the wound A would have been toward the right, kind of between the side of the body and the arm.
As part of your, as a forensic pathologist, as part of your evaluation of injuries, are you trying to think through the position that a body might have been at the time that a certain pattern of injuries occurred?
Yes, so part of my analysis, if I have no indication of what may have caused these injuries, would be to think of them individually or as a group or groups to try to come up with an idea of what type of object or instrument could have caused this. And then if an instrument is posed to me as either known to or likely to have caused those injuries, I would then analyze the injuries with that object in mind, trying to understand if it's possible to have this injury, set of injuries caused by that object.
All right, in this case, the materials you've been provided indicate that there was an object called a corn rake that was involved in these injuries?
Yes.
Did you, as part of your analysis, have an opportunity to examine the corn rake at issue in this case?
I saw photographs of the corn rake.
In your mind, based on everything that you reviewed, is there any question that wounds A through F were caused by Ms. Mullis's body coming in contact with that corn rake in some way?
From looking at the injuries and from all of the information that I reviewed, the injuries are consistent with that, and I did not see anything where that was debated that was the object that caused these injuries.
Thinking about the corn rake that we're talking about, do you know what the distance between the tines of that corn rake are?
So the distance between the tines is just shy of 3 inches, so it's almost 3 inches.
How do you have that number?
From a photograph.
Given, so in your analysis, understanding that the object at issue here is this corn rake and that you have these injuries on Ms. Mullis's back, in your opinion, is there a pattern to the injuries on Ms. Mullis's back that we're looking at?
There is, yes.
And what is your opinion about what that pattern is?
My opinion is that there's 3 injuries that you can cluster together that have similar features, which is A, B, and C. There's 2 injuries that have similar features, E and F, that you can cluster together, and then there is wound D, which is kind of on its own and a little bit separate in its orientation and features.
How are you able to determine that A, B, and C are sort of one set of connected injuries?
So looking at the spacing between them, so the wounds B and C has a 3-inch length between them, and wounds A and B is 4.5 inches. That 4.5 inches is over a curved part of the body, however. So in reality, a more narrow object could make both of those injuries at the same time if it's penetrating the body, particularly at an angle. And they also have a similar orientation of the wounds themselves if you face them on like the face of a clock. So they're all going in, all 3 of them are in the same orientation that way.
And so when you say they're in the same orientation, explain to me what you mean by that.
So when we describe injuries, we can describe them using the face of a clock. So if something is straight up and down, so in orientation with the head and the feet would be straight up and down, that's vertical. You could describe that as vertical, or you could describe it as 12 o'clock and 6 o'clock. If something is across the body from left to right, like straight across, you could describe that as transverse or horizontal. but putting it on the face of the clock, you could use 3 o'clock and 9 o'clock. And then anything else would be oblique, and you could place it on the face of a clock using, 2 o'clock and 7 o'clock, for example. And so looking at these 3 injuries, they had a similar oblique orientation on the face of a clock that Dr. Cruz documented in her autopsy report.
Is your opinion about the orientation of Ms. Mullis's wounds different from Dr. Cruz's opinion about the orientation of any of these 6 wounds, A through F?
No, it is not.
You also said that E and F are wounds that you would group together, is that right?
Yes.
And why is that your opinion?
So they're 3 3/4 of an inch apart, which is, again, pretty similar to what A and B and C are, but they have a different orientation. When you put it on the face of the clock, they're both the same, E and F, but they're different from A, B, and C, and they're different than D.
What is their orientation?
These were at, my recollection is 5 o'clock and 11 o'clock is how they were described.
All right, and you said that D is in a different group?
Yeah, so D had an orientation that was just one basically number off of A, B, and C. So it was just slightly differently oriented than A, B, and C.
I want to take you back to Exhibit 573. Sorry, tell me what you're saying. All right, we're showing you Exhibit 573 again. Now, Exhibit 573, is that the same image that appears on the left 2 of the photos that you were looking at a moment ago that is marked?
The ones that we just looked at that was a straight on of the back. This is from an angle.
All right, and let me go back and show you the last photo, the second to last photo that we looked at.
Okay.
While we're doing that, let me actually ask you, well, let me show you this exhibit first. I want to ask you a different question, and we'll come back to this. You mentioned that wounds A and B looked different than the other wounds on the back. Can you explain why those, or how those wounds had a different appearance?
Sure. So wound A, even more so than wound B, had a much larger overall size. And around the wound, so the skin around wounds A and B had additional abrasion and contusion of the surrounding skin. So in addition to the wound being larger, there was also injury to the skin around the wounds that was different than the rest of the injuries.
All right, I'm going to show you Exhibit 561. What does Exhibit 561 depict?
So this is wound A on the right side of the body. This shows the medical therapy at the top, which is the chest tube that was inserted at the hospital. And then,
just to interrupt you, the chest tube is not wound A.
Correct, that's the medical therapy. And then below that is wound A. So there's a hole in the skin, and then there's a sort of pink to red to kind of dark, maybe purplish color around the skin around that wound A, and that is the abrasion and contusion of the skin around that wound.
So is the appearance of wound A different from the appearances of wounds C through F?
Yes.
And
here's what I found.
what specifically about the appearance of wound A in this picture was different than wounds C through F?
So rather than just having a little bit of injury around the actual wound in the skin, there was this enlarged area of abrasion and contusion around the wound. So that discoloration of the skin is different than the other wounds.
All right, I want to go back and show you one more time Exhibit 573. All right, do you see wound B in this picture?
Yes.
How was the appearance of wound B different from wound C through F?
So wound B also has that injury of the skin, that's abrasion and contusion, and this time it's above the injury, so more toward the top of the picture, and it has, from here, has kind of like a pinkish to purple coloration, and the wound itself is actually at the bottom of that, and then that discoloration and injury of the skin is above.
Did you take into account the characteristics of the corn rake in this case in thinking through how to group these injuries?
Yes.
And how did you do that?
So thinking about the spacing of the tines of the corn rake being just about 3 inches, and trying to look at on the body, knowing that the body can move some or even extensively, and then looking at the features of the tines. The ends of the tines are kind of flattened, and they then sort of expand to a more rounded part of the tine. And so when I looked at the injuries and looked at Dr. Cruz's measurements, she measured all of them ultimately when she kind of reapproximated the edges of the injuries at 1/16 of an inch, which is consistent with the tines on the rake penetrating the skin, and allowed for that orientation of those tines, since they're flattened, into the body.
All right, and I want to understand what you just said. When you talk about reapproximating the edges of the injury, explain to me what that process entails.
Sure. So when a body is injured, there are invisible lines that are elastic forces in the skin that everybody has. And so when the skin is damaged, those elastic lines can pull on the wound, and they can cause them to what we call gape, or to kind of be kind of open. So if we take our hands and we remove some of that tension, we can actually make a much more accurate measurement of the wound. And so that's what Dr. Cruz did. So she reapproximated or took the edges of the wound and kind of pushed them back together to see where there was a piece of tissue that was actually lost from the puncture of that tine. And so when she did that, each of the wounds were 1/16 of an inch. That was the size of all 6 of them. Being able to push that back together, you got that approximation. So those were all the same, which made it consistent with one object also. But when you push that back together, that also allows, so you basically have this 1/16 of an inch, and then it was angled, right, or obliquely oriented like we described before. And so looking at the size and the fact that you can tell an orientation as opposed to it being just like a circle, basically, you can then look at the ends of those tines, which are flattened, and see that flattened end of the tine is consistent with what we're seeing on the body when you reapproximate the wounds.
All right, Dr. Hammers, I'm not a doctor, but is it your testimony that the holes in Ms. Mullis's back are not round?
When you reapproximate them, they're not round.
All right, and is the end of the corn rake round?
No, they're flattened to, I don't want to say it's rectangular, but they're flattened to that type of shape. And
does the fact that the wounds have an oblique shape, as you've described, and the corn rake has an oblique shape, does that allow you to determine, as you've described, the orientation of the wound and the orientation of the rake at the time that the rake made any of these wounds?
Yes. So because all 4 of the tines are flattened, if you have 3 wounds that have a similar orientation, and that would indicate that 3 tines are going in likely at the same time in that similar orientation.
All right, and with all of those factors in mind and those factors in your analysis that you've testified about, do you have an opinion on which, if any, of wounds A through F were caused at the same time?
So looking at just the body, from the pattern of the injuries and the individual features of each injury, it appears that wounds A, B, and C occurred at a similar time, wounds E and F at a similar time, and wound D at a somewhat different time.
And are you basing that opinion just on their orientation?
So it's the orientation and the features of the wounds.
In thinking through that, well, let me ask you this first. Do you have an opinion on the order of wounds A through F being caused?
Well, my opinion is that wounds A and B, given the features around them, is that those likely occurred in the first set of injuries and then remained in the body while other injuries occurred, given the fact that they're distorted and they have injury of the skin beyond what the other injuries have.
I want to go back to Exhibit 561 briefly. Looking at Exhibit 561 and wound A that's depicted in 561, what about this wound leads you to conclude that a tine went into wound A and remained there?
So if you take a long blunt object and it penetrates into the skin and then there's movement, it's going to cause bruising and abrasion of that surrounding skin. So if it goes straight in and straight out, we would, without any movement, we would not expect there to be this larger area of injury of the skin. So the fact that the wound is larger and has this area on the surface of the skin is very consistent with movement, and then ultimately putting that into the context of what was seen on the internal examination, that's also very supportive of that as well. So I'm talking right now about the skin itself, but my conclusions are made using the internal exam as well.
And we'll get to the internal exam in a moment, but just looking, thinking about your evaluation of wound A, how do you know, for instance, for wound A, that the features of the wound that you're describing, which you attribute to a tine being in wound A and being moved around, how do you know that those features aren't caused by a tine of the corn rake coming all the way out of wound A and then going back into wound A?
So first of all, the statistical probability of a tine coming out and going back into the same spot is very low. Second of all, I would expect that the features of the wound would not have that pattern when you reapproximate them, that it would be 1/16 of an inch, just like the rest of the injuries, that it would be more extended beyond that or more irregular. So the fact that we can reapproximate to that 1/16 of an inch is highly indicative of one penetrating injury.
And what is that issue in terms of reapproximating the size of the wound? What is your determination about the size of wound B in that respect?
Wound B also, when you approximate it, is 1/16 of an inch, just like the rest of them. So all of the wounds are consistent with the tine penetrating the body one time, and then A and B are consistent with movement of the tines while they're in the body from that one penetrating defect.
All right.
Ms. Thompson, would this be a good place for a morning break?
I think it would, Your Honor.
Okay. All right. Doctor, you may step down.
Thank you.
Let's go ahead and take 15 minutes. We'll plan on picking up at about 10 after. Court's in recess until then.
Your Honor, I'm just going to instruct the witness not to talk to anyone. I'm not going to confirm. No, just